Okay, thanks for joining us today. Today we have Supervisor Kristin Gaspar and Terra Lawson-Remer, who are candidates in the county supervisor race for District 3. They'll get closing statements at the end, but we'll just jump right into questions. And if you see us looking down at our notes, that means we're looking down at our notes or checking you in real time, which Zoom allows us to do. And I'll ask some of the questions at the start and then open it up to the board as we progress here. But let's just jumping right into things. Obviously, today was a big day in San Diego County. We're going to stay in the red tier and not take a step back. So I guess my first question, Supervisor, to you is how do you balance the need for businesses to reopen and to endure this pandemic with the need to keep everyone safe and to follow the science? What is your kind of balancing act there?
Sure. Well, this is day 192, if you can believe it, of the pandemic response. And on the local level, it's important to note that San Diego really led in our pandemic response by over 2 weeks. We've had a collaborative hospital system here in San Diego. We had all 22 of our hospitals come together and flex and operate as one, which is critically important. At this point in time, there have been extended impacts due to the length of the closures, and certainly the small business community is hurting a lot at this point in time. Thankfully, we've learned a lot about this virus over the past 6 months. I've been an advocate for more local control. More local control would give us the beauty of examining our local data. Currently, the pandemic is being managed on a statewide basis, and California is a large and very diverse state. So a number of large urban counties are really struggling because the metrics they're being compared on aren't necessarily appropriate for a large urban county. I think the value of local control would be the ability for our public health officer to really explore the underlying dynamics here in San Diego with our local data. San Diego State, I think, was an important example for us as a community. So here we have a university where kids are interacting from all over the world. The kids aren't getting sick at school. The campus has been closed, and very little has spread beyond the campus environment. In fact, at this point, I think it's only about 10 cases have gotten out into the broader community. This is a younger demographic. We've learned a lot in our science and data over the past 6 months about our younger demographic and whether those cases will ultimately transition into hospitalized cases, because again, the goal was to make sure we didn't overwhelm our hospital system. So we can likely presume that those cases will not hit our emergency rooms and our hospitals and such. So a 5-0 United board asked the governor to consider not removing those cases, but considering whether it was appropriate to go through a third shutdown of our business community because of the San Diego State University situation. Again, the beauty of local control, we have our docs and our clinicians here taking a look at our local numbers, and they're all in agreement that it's not appropriate to apply those cases. So just as we move forward, I hope that our United board will continue to ask the governor for more local control over our management of this pandemic. But at the end of the day, we have to meet people where they are. We have to protect the vulnerable. These are people like my parents that I haven't seen since February because they're in that higher risk category. Very important to understand where our workforce is at too. A number of people are not able to return to work. They may be at risk. They may live in a multi-generational home. They may have family members that are at risk, or they might just have elevated concerns, and that's okay. We need to be as flexible as possible during these challenging times and really meet people where they are with our response.
A quick follow-up for you. I know that your colleague on the Board of Supervisors, Jim Desmond, has made comments in the past about the data, pure cases of deaths. Do you trust the data coming from the government sources? Or are you skeptical about it?
I never want to look at cases of death. That's a worst case scenario, right? That someone has actually passed from this illness. I think it's really important that we look at our case numbers. Currently, we're only being really evaluated on our case numbers. How many are there? And the reason why I think it's inappropriate to just look at case numbers, I think you need to look at the demographics of those case numbers, because at this point in time, it's not just San Diego specific, but across this country and across this globe, we've learned a lot about the demographics and those cases translating into hospitalizations. For a long time, people said it was inappropriate to look at just hospitalizations, and it is, because that's a lagging indicator. But I do think we can do a deeper dive into our data. We have all of it readily available. You've seen it on our website. Our epidemiology team has put in a lot of effort and work to really drill down on our local stats. Now let's use it. Let's apply our local data, our local information, to make informed decisions.
Terra, question to you. If you were on the board now, how would you handle the data, the scientific data, and the need or the desire of businesses to reopen? How would you balance that?
It's such an incredibly important question. As you all know, I spent a lot of my time and a lot of my life looking at and working with data and using data to inform evidence-based policymaking. That's my background as a researcher, as an academic. So I do think we have to zoom back, right? I mean, the core goal here is twofold. One is to protect public health and ensure people don't get sick and people don't die. And two, to protect our economy and make sure our businesses can get reopened as quickly as possible and our workers can not lose their jobs and lose their income. Those are the dual goals. I think our board, unfortunately, as well as many policymakers, have thought of these as opposed, as opposite things that need to be balanced. And the data, the evidence, the research from around the world shows that's actually fundamentally not true. That the countries and the communities that invested first in public health, that invested first in getting their case numbers down, quickly have now been able to reopen. So for example, you can compare Sweden and you compare Denmark. Both of them have had the same level of economic contraction, about 4.3%. Denmark had a much stricter initial response, closed businesses for a much longer time. Sweden did not. Sweden has had 11 times more case fatalities. And now Denmark has a very low case number, and their economy is reopened and businesses are operating again, while Sweden is still struggling. So everywhere that we can look around the world that said, look, we're going to not just try to hurry up and get our, artificially try to exclude some cases to this place and that place to get our case numbers down so we can quickly reopen, but instead, so we're going to be disciplined. We're going to stay sort of with the stricter social distancing measures, have then been able to reopen. And I think it's been a real betrayal of our small businesses and a real betrayal of our local economy to not have the leadership and the foresight to say, like, let's just have the discipline, stay closed, get our case numbers down, and then we can reopen and stay open. Because this approach of always trying to game the system, always trying to say, well, how can we figure out how to count as few cases as possible so we can get in sort of the right zone according to purple or red, and then accelerate our reopening, is what's causing this opening closing fluctuation, which is frankly impossible for businesses to handle because they have to do all the investments in getting ready to allow people indoors, and then all of a sudden they're shut down again, and it's totally not fair to them whatsoever. So my approach would be, look at the evidence from everywhere around the world, best practices, countries that have done much better than us, say what's working. One of the things we know is working is putting public health first as a first investment into reopening our economy. And the other thing that we've seen has not worked in the United States is this approach where, let 1,000 flowers bloom, local control, where now you have some states in this country saying nobody should wear masks. Other places people are wearing masks. We have 25% of the world's case count and only 2% of the world's population. And that's because of this sort of a guise of trying to never take responsibility that we're in this together, and take responsibility for the most vulnerable members of our population, and say we want to do it our way in our own community, and we don't care what's happening to everyone else, which has led to these rising case numbers. So I think that's also quite wrong-headed, and is part of why we're in such a bad situation in the US. So my approach would be, let's create some predictability for businesses. Let's do the work to get our case numbers much lower, and let's reopen and let's stay open, as opposed to being on this roller coaster.
And can I ask really quickly, what do you say to that argument that San Diego County is a very large county, very different environments from one corner to the other. There's a vast difference between downtown San Diego and East County San Diego, Northeast County San Diego. What do you say to that argument that there should be different rules for these different areas?
So it is a very diverse county, and I think that's part of what makes San Diego such an extraordinary, diverse, interesting place. But in fact, there's much more circulation among people in the community than it would be acknowledged by just saying you can like cordon off SDSU. Actually, people don't live on campus. They live in the local community. They interact with local businesses. Then those folks have family members who have family members in other part of the county. They go to restaurants in other part of the county. I mean, if we had a, if we did something very draconian and you wanted to lock everyone in their like neighborhood for 2 months, then okay. But like, I don't support that. I don't think people should be locked in their neighborhood. I support an integrated county. I believe that we should all be interacting with each other and not, having some kind of lockdown of that nature. So, if we take people and meet people where they are, which is the reality of how people live and work in San Diego, it is not segregated in that way. It is much more integrated. And that is indeed why when Governor Newsom's health officials looked at the request that the county supervisors put in front of them, he refused it because he said that is wishful thinking, that you cannot just make these numbers go away just because it would be convenient to do so. And I want to say it would be very convenient if those numbers didn't exist. I wish they did not exist, but just because I wish they did not exist does not mean that they actually do not exist. And so I think that I'm very grateful actually for the governor to have come along and the public health officials at the state level to have not let our wishful thinking trip us up, and instead saying, looking at the epidemiological data about how folks travel and work within San Diego, those communities are not actually cordoned off and are not segregated.
Supervisor, let me ask you about the kind of law enforcement response, both in terms of mask wearing and in terms of businesses and how businesses enforce regulations or do not enforce regulations. Are you comfortable with the sheriff's response and your role as a supervisor, or do you think the county should have been doing and may do something different in the future?
I think from the onset, the county should have taken the lead in the enforcement versus our law enforcement taking boots off the ground and reassigning them, so to speak, to enforce these things. Some visuals that come to mind were 5 deputies with 5 vehicles showing up to shut down a Little League game. The optics of that are just so poor. So I was supportive when my colleagues moved forward with the county taking the lead on that enforcement, creating those teams that would work on safe reopenings. I think it was inappropriate from the onset to task that back to our law enforcement, not a good use of their time and energy. We get thousands of phone calls every day, and they range. They range from my neighbors outside walking a dog without a mask to, some more extreme cases where you have businesses that are just choosing not to follow protocols at all. So we have to field all of those calls. We have to respond to the needs that are expressed in those calls. But at the same time, I just think it was highly inappropriate for law enforcement to be put in that situation.
Terra, how would you have approached that vis-a-vis enforcement, and whether law enforcement or the county should take the lead?
I think it's important to enforce the law. Period. And I think that law enforcement plays a critical role in enforcing the law. Of course, that goes within the fact that there's many other things that they need to be doing with their time, right? It's not the only thing on their plate. So it has to be balanced. But I think that where the county has really fallen down is not stepping forward to give enough support to our small businesses to meet the exigencies of this moment, right? It's completely unfair to expect that small businesses alone, without more funding, more support, are going to be able to quickly revamp to protect all of us. So I think there's both sides of it, right? Like, of course, we need to be enforcing the mandates and enforcing the law, but we also need to be providing the support, especially for businesses, to do the right thing, because many of them very much want to do the right thing, and it's just been very difficult to do that. And I think the county could be doing a lot more to support our businesses.
I'm wondering how, apart from the day job or the campaign, how personally you've approached life in the pandemic and being of service, right? So much of the job that you have, Kristin, and that you want to have, Terra, is community service. So let me ask you, what have you been doing in terms of community service since the pandemic started? And Terra, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think it's such a wonderful question. So from right off the bat, I mean, before things were really organized and we really knew what was going to unfold, we started making phone calls just to our neighbors to check in, especially on our elderly neighbors, to say, how are you? Do you need anything? Can we be helpful? And what we found, and what I found, was a lot of my calls was actually not to deliver them groceries, which is what I thought initially, but was just to talk. Because people were scared and people were lonely. So I spent a lot of time doing that, just calling, especially my elderly neighbors who, felt very scared and very, very isolated. So that was straight off the bat. That was number one. And I think the other thing that's been really important is just recognizing how many families have been thrown out of work and are now food insecure. So helping out with food banks and delivering food and supporting that. I actually have not myself been going to deliver the food, but I've been supporting on the back end, and I haven't been doing that because I've been pretty isolated. I actually interact with two people who are very vulnerable. So my efforts have been, to the extent possible, to sort of support the work of those who are not interacting with at-risk populations.
And Supervisor, how have you tried to be of service in your personal life in the last 6 months?
Well, initially it was hitting a giant pause button on the campaign. We had just come out of that March primary. Critically important to me was to be there for my community during one of the most challenging times imaginable. So early on, I've witnessed this pandemic from several vantage points. As you know, I'm a mom, and I have 3 school-aged children. I have elementary school, middle school, high school. And so it was really important for me to support other families during this time. As a business owner, really playing that cash on hand game. How long can we keep our employees on payroll? How long can we cover their medical insurance? I knew that there were great challenges for our business community straight away. So the most important thing was me not worrying about the campaign, but really worrying about being in the chair and doing a good job and supporting my community. I have visuals day in and day out of entering the county building when it was closed to the public, dark corridors, using my flashlight from my cell phone to light the way. My thought was that every minute that I spend here is a minute we're not spending in this pandemic response. And pretty early on, the public health officer made a comment that really stuck to me. And she said that, we've all been asked to make minor sacrifices. And that's simply not the case. We're all in this together, but we're not all experiencing this pandemic in quite the same way. And we need to learn to appreciate how people have experienced this and the challenges that are before them. So early on with the business community, it was unclear how long things would be shut down. The most important thing to me was to walk with them hand in hand, although virtually at the time, and support them. Because we needed to go through all of the relief measures that might be available that we had as a small business, I wanted to extend that knowledge. So a lot of Zoom calls with the business community, helping them to understand the relief measures that were on the horizon, how they could apply. That quickly transitioned into creating safety plans and protocols. What most people don't know, I have a very robust COVID-19 pandemic portfolio, and it really showcases the extensive work that I've been through. I've been out on so many site visits, helping people think about their layout, what they can do to comply beautifully with the public health orders, how they craft their business safe reopening plans. I've created those with the business community. We would take those plans and protocols by business sector. We'd send them to the CAO. We'd send them for review with our public health officer to see if she had any comments back. And I really did appreciate their involvement early on to make sure that once we had the green light from the governor, once we had the green light from our public health officer, that they were ready to go and weren't wasting any time. We have not rushed through this at all. We've been very careful, and I have never walked in front of our public health officer or the governor and his orders and reopenings of the business sector. The other piece that was important to me was being supportive back out in the community. Early on, we had shortages with PPE. We were trying to figure out how we could get inventory to businesses that needed them the most. Sometimes it was a box of gloves that made all of the difference. So I've participated a lot in the distribution of PPE, also in setting up the alternative care sites. For a while, we were very concerned about potential surges in COVID-19 cases. Very early on, I participated in 2 innovative projects. One was an effort with UCSD student housing. Because they sent the students home, we had an opportunity to create an alternative care site. There, we could house 350 beds where doctors and nurses could creatively live on site with lower level cases if need be. Very pleased to report the business community was responsive to my request to providing the beds and the infrastructure that we needed. And in no time, we had 350 beds set up. I've never set up so many mattresses in my life, but we got that done. And good news is we never needed it. But that didn't stop my efforts. I moved on to asking the federal government for help, asking them for a federal medical station. We needed a shell space to quickly set up 250 additional beds and all the supplies we would need. And one of our hospital partners stepped forward at Palomar and said, hey, we've got 2 empty floors. And it was a brilliant opportunity for us to quickly stand up another 250 beds. At the time, building capacity in the system was key. And so it was really important that I worked on those projects. The community should know that both of those projects, we haven't needed it. We haven't experienced that surge, but that was a protective measure that was there. Also, during this time, I turned my attention to the situation that was at hand across the border in Mexico, a real humanitarian crisis that was brewing in Tijuana at the time. What we hadn't thought a lot about were the number of US citizens living in the Baja region, those expats, and what was happening is they were coming back across the border to receive medical care. So you saw places like Imperial County that was getting hit hard. And so it meant stepping outside of the San Diego bubble and also helping to uplift other counties that were in need. So it just seems like it's been such a long journey, but I'm really proud of the time and the work that I've put in to just be there for our community, still with the same philosophy. 192 days later, I wake up every day thinking that I'm reliving a bit of the same nightmare and this can't really be happening, but our community is really come together, and I'm proud of all of the efforts that have taken place, and I'm proud of my involvement in this response specifically.
Let me ask you another pandemic-related question, how it has affected your thinking on housing and transit, obviously 2 huge issues in San Diego County. And if you can keep your answers brief, just in the interest of time. But Terra, why don't we start with you? Generally, do you still feel the same about 5 big moves as you might have in March? And specifically, what has changed about your thinking of housing or transit as it relates to the pandemic and how life may change going forward?
Yeah, so one thing I'm always trying to look for a silver lining, even though in this moment of COVID, it is incredibly difficult to do that. But one thing I do think is has gotten my attention is that so many businesses have been able to allow employees to work from home. And we do know that 40% of our carbon emissions in San Diego come from cars idling in traffic. So I do think we have a huge opportunity to partner with the business community to encourage them to, even post-COVID, to continue to allow employees to work from home on a rotating schedule, so that we can continue having fewer cars on the road and less traffic without necessarily having to build more roads or build big transit investments. And I think that's really promising, right? There's a real win-win there in terms of getting traffic off our roads, but also reducing carbon emissions. So that's definitely something I think I've been thinking very differently because of COVID, and I think is an opportunity. I've already been talking to a lot of folks in the business community about this, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm to build this kind of collaborative initiative, like a public-private partnership around encouraging work from home options to tackle this issue. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about differently. I do think more broadly, I remain, pretty excited about the notion that we're beginning to build broader understanding that we need to do something to tackle traffic and congestion in San Diego County. There's a lot of folks who prior to COVID and certainly after COVID, they're going to spend an hour and a half idling in traffic to get from home to work. And it's really a huge problem in terms of our quality of life. So obviously we need to be investing in repairing our roads and investing in public transit options as well, where that makes sense. So I'm very excited, frankly, about sort of the energy towards that direction, among others who I'll be working with on the Board of Supervisors. In terms of the specifics, I don't think my views have changed much, right? I think that we need to be adopting a pretty diverse set of investments. Again, our county is quite diverse, and then the transit solutions that we need across our county are very different. Certainly in many aspects, in many parts of our district, the priority is going to be repairing our roads, building more HOV lanes, doing more to allow people who for whom public transit doesn't make sense to see the benefits of those investments. In other parts of San Diego, down in Hillcrest and the Gas Lamp and downtown, North Park, you definitely can see that there would be a benefit to more transit investments. So I think we have to be thinking holistically, and my thinking has been the same on that, since the beginning. So in terms of housing, Matt, I always try to answer your questions. Transit, housing. So in terms of housing, one of the things that has been a problem in San Diego for a very long time is the lack of affordable housing. And that remains true in this crisis. It's not different. So I'm happy to elaborate further on how I think we should prioritize and how the county will prioritize under my leadership tackling the affordable housing crisis. But that wasn't the question you asked. So, but if you would like to talk more about affordable housing, I think it is a key challenge.
That's on our list, so we'll get to that. But
Okay.
Supervisor, how would you respond to that question of how the pandemic has changed your thinking on transit and housing?
Well, the 5 bold moves was a really bad idea pre-pandemic. It's a worse idea post-pandemic. The 6th bold move that rarely ever is spoken about is how we're going to pay for a $177 billion mass transit plan for San Diego. And the 6th bold move really is a massive tax hike again, even though we've already assumed a sales tax increase for a long, long time, since I was 7 years old, in fact. And the second piece being this new creation of pay to drive. So paying to drive in every lane on the highway. People are struggling in San Diego County. Look at the recent numbers. Twice as many unemployed San Diegans right now, which by the way, this isn't the high of the pandemic, but right now, twice as many unemployed as in all of the years of the Great Recession combined. 1 million people in our safety net programs and 900,000 people that have absolutely no idea where their next meal is coming from. If that isn't a reality check, I don't know what is. This is a misguided plan for San Diego. We need balanced approaches to transportation. At the same time, we need transportation plans that we can actually implement and move people with. The second piece on affordable housing, I've been an outspoken critic for the failed plans for housing for this region. Specifically, when the Regional Housing Needs Assessment came before the SANDAG board, time and time again, they create a plan to fail, a plan where everyone sits around the table and says, yeah, we support affordable housing, but yet the plan that they generate shoves all of that housing and that plan into some of the most expensive parts of San Diego, hugging the coastline and the transit corridors there. It will never be achieved. So how about we actually construct some affordable housing this go around? We're nearing the end of a 10-year housing cycle. We were supposed to generate 150,000 housing units to keep up with the demand for San Diego. Lo and behold, we're deficient. In fact, we're 100,000 units short. And of the housing we've constructed 40,000 units in that above market rate category and only 10,000 units in the very low to moderate income category. It's no wonder we have so much traffic, because people can't afford to live here. These are people, this is our workforce. They're living in far-reaching areas of Riverside, San Bernardino, Temecula, commuting in each and every day, clogging our roadways, transportation and housing go hand in hand. It's about time that we get realistic, stop coming up with these failed plans so that we can actually move forward as a region.
Thank you. Let me, before we move on to certain issues, anyone on the board have a question related to the pandemic or the last 6 months?
The density issue jumps to mind only because during the pandemic, a lot of issues have been raised about how closely we do live together. So I just want to hear people discuss whether higher density is the answer or not.
Supervisor, why don't
if
you
you're
go first?
asking me, yes. We've seen communities really struggle. We've seen communities that are very dense, like take New York, for example, take different areas of San Diego, for example. If you compare the numbers, look at the housing, a much different situation for North County. I think that it's important to take these things into consideration. At the same time, we do need a mix of housing for our region. Right now, we have not achieved that. And so we do have to strike a careful balance. This pandemic will eventually conclude, at least I hope it does, but it doesn't mean that these aren't future considerations. We're not pandemic resilient as a region, but it certainly calls into question how functional mass transit is during a pandemic period when you need more space from others. And also with the housing situation as well. We've seen a number of families really struggle with intergenerational households, for example. You have the more vulnerable living here. All of these things, you know, are considerations, but if you ask me, it's really important that we have a balance of housing so that people can grow in their community. I have 3 examples at home with my kids of individuals I would love to come back to the San Diego region. You know, I hope they go out and they get a wonderful college education. They come back with a degree, they're gonna fight in a tight job market, and they're never gonna be able to afford to live in San Diego today. And it's really sad. These are my own kids. These are all of our kids. And then for me, I turned 40 this year, so I'm thinking about growing older in my community. And what is there to offer for me? I run a senior home team repair. We're doing repairs in people's homes, and people are fighting desperately to stay in their housing because there aren't any other options. But quite frankly, they're living in some really unsafe conditions as seniors trying to stay here in San Diego. So let's create a very vibrant mix of housing so that we can grow up and grow old in our community. Who wants to move from San Diego? This is really one of the most magical places that I can think of on the planet.
Terra, the density housing question to you.
I think we have to be very practical, right? I mean, fundamentally, we have to figure out how to provide affordable housing for the folks who live and work in San Diego, and do it in a way that, you know, improves people's quality of life and is convenient and affordable. Some of that will certainly be density, and some of it won't be. And I think different people have different preferences about where they live, which is one of the things about San Diego that's so great, right? You know, you can choose to live in a dense community, you can choose to live in a less dense community, and I think we should respect that. I just want to push back a little on sort of the notion that it's density alone is the cause of this pandemic. Actually, again, I'm a very data-driven person, so you know, sort of look at other countries around the world and other communities who've done a really good job of tackling COVID-19, and some of them are quite dense, and other places that are very rural have done a terrible job. And it has a lot more to do with effective public leadership, effective public health interventions, you know, and people looking out for each other, and that's what's been driving this. So you know, I think we have to look at a whole range of factors, but you know, my number one priority is making sure that people can afford to have a place to live in this community. It's a really just such a special place, and it's very, very unfair and very unfortunate that a lot of folks are being pushed out.
California has the highest poverty rate in the nation, as was established in 2011 by the Census Bureau when it began factoring in the cost of living. And for 9 years, Democrats have done nothing to lay a glove on this problem. So when you talk about following the data and being an economist, that's great. That's wonderful to hear. But when is the California Democratic Party going to start doing things that have worked in other places? In Japan and in Great Britain, 15 to 25% of new housing is prefab. And yet in California, we can't get this going at all. So the same question goes to the supervisor. why do we do things that don't work when evidently there's things that can work elsewhere in the nation? It's amazingly frustrating to me how dysfunctional the California Democratic Party is in responding to poor people's problems.
I just want to, first of all, thank you for thinking outside the box a little bit and looking for other solutions. And that's exactly why I'm running for the seat, right? I think our supervisors and our county board of supervisors have failed us for a really long time. And I would agree that we haven't effectively addressed this at any level of government. And I have had the opportunity to work around the world, to work in other communities and other countries that have done a better job. I think there's a lot of opportunities, not just in prefab, but there's a lot of other places and ways in which we can borrow from what works in terms of tackling affordable housing and tackling some of our other issues in our community, and bring people together to just be focused on solving problems, looking for best practices and solving problems and bringing those best practices here to San Diego. And we just haven't done that. You know, we've had leadership. I mean, I will be honest, if I thought our board of supervisors was doing a good job on addressing these problems, I wouldn't be running for the seat, you know. And I think Kristin did a really good job of laying out all the ways in which the supervisors are doing a really bad job. And that's why I'm running. And, you know, Chris, I can't promise you, but, you know, maybe if I was in a position to influence those decisions at the statewide level, we might be going in a better direction as well.
This is a regional issue. The SANDAG board has a lot to do with this issue, and I have a fundamental disagreement with how things have been managed, as I mentioned, with arena calculations, with transportation for this region as well. I also have a big problem with the red tape that exists in California and how much pours into the cost of constructing a single unit in California. On top of that, I have a big problem with the number of units that are held hostage in court through CEQA lawsuits. To date, we actually have 5,000 housing units that have been approved that are sitting held hostage in the courtroom. And that's just San Diego County. If you were to add up all of the units that have been approved throughout the San Diego region and are held hostage in court, it would be a tremendous number. We'd actually be moving forward. So we do need a lot of reforms. The litigation that exists on each and every project is problematic. And so many of these aren't controversial projects, but they're still held up in court. There has to be a better way to move forward. Some things that I've done on the county side that were very unique. When I got to the county of San Diego, I put a canvas of a housewife on my wall for a reason. If you ever come visit me there. Oh, it's the county. Everything's perfect. Look away. Don't ask any questions. We've got this. We know what we're doing. We've fiscally managed this place for decades. Please don't ask any questions. And I thought it's okay for government to admit places where they need to make improvements and strive forward. We shouldn't be embarrassed by that. We should acknowledge that. We should be on a constant quest to look and learn from other jurisdictions and bring that innovation back to San Diego. That's actually been the hallmark of my success on the board, is learning and growing outside of San Diego and bringing that innovation here. You saw that when I started the Building Better Roads initiative. There's no reason why it should cost so much to pave all of our lane miles here. We've got so many potholes to fill in each municipality and roads to pave. There's a better way. And the better way was to actually talk to industry, find out what the barriers were. And lo and behold, it turned out a very simple solution. Allowing more recycled product into the overlay would make a dramatic difference. It's little things like that, but you have to be able to engage with others. Other jurisdictions have to engage with industry. One thing I did was sit myself in the chair on some roundtable meetings that were happening within the departments in the county of San Diego. They freaked out when they got a request that I wanted to attend these land use meetings internally on some projects that were really going sideways. A supervisor had never done that before, but it was important because it helped me understand that San Diego, with its 17,000 employees and so many different departments, sometimes works in silos, and the planning department is no exception. And it really was eye-opening to see the work that was being done in silos. No one's talking to one another. This drives up the costs of all of these projects, and it's part of the reason why it's so expensive to do business in California, to construct homes in California. lots of different things that need to be confronted on this issue. And thankfully, I've always been very vocal when I find them, not shying away from where we need to make improvements. But I also need the help of other regional leaders. And the SANDAG board under that AB 805 structure is just terrible. North County, East County, voiceless. All the decisions come down to San Diego and Chula Vista. It just isn't right.
Abby, did you have a question earlier?
I was just going to follow up on housing, and they've never addressed what I was going to ask.
Okay.
So,
If you want, I mean, I'd love to talk about housing if that's something you guys are interested in.
Do you have a specific question, Abby, or no? You're good.
well, I also realized we said we were going to get to it down the road, so
Yeah.
now or later.
Yeah, let me ask, wildfires ravaging the state. So this is kind of a question about housing. Ravaging the state. Sprawl is an issue here in San Diego County. How do you balance the need for housing versus the need to, make sure that houses don't burn to the ground, which you've seen in California and you've seen in San Diego County. And Supervisor, why don't you go first? And again, if you keep your answers brief, I'd appreciate it.
I'm not exactly good at that, but prevention is really key. Preparedness is really key when it comes to wildfires. The proper infrastructure is key to these projects. We saw a project that was not approved by the Board of Supervisors. We had an expressed concern from our fire chief, and we listened to the concerns of our fire chief. So as we evaluate these projects, that's very important that you listen to the experts out there, the boots on the ground. At the same time, set them up for success. So I've spent a lot of time making sure that we're investing the resources needed. We learned a lot as a county in 2006 from the wildfires. There was a renewed commitment by the board to make investments and make sure that we improved the situation and never let something like that happen again, and did everything to protect property and human life. Some of those investments I've made on the board is investing in our wireless cameras. These are in far-reaching areas of the county that are very prone to wildfire. These cameras can instantly detect any smoke, any fire, and in real time can launch a full effort by our response team. We also needed to make investments in their ability to coordinate with one another and between agencies. So it's not just CAL FIRE that's responding out there. It's a variety of stations and departments, all hands on deck. We've never had so many vehicles, so many air resources, so many creative strategies, agreements that we've signed with the military. And you see when a wildfire does spring up in San Diego County, it is all hands on deck, just the way it should be. But a lot of attention needs to be paid ahead of time. That's why I've also helped to prepare the community as well. Been an active member of the Listos campaign, making sure that people are ready to go in their communities and prepared for these events. But we just have to be mindful as we move forward, not only with construction projects, new developments, but just as a community, we have to be ready, ready to respond and ready to prevent the preventable.
Terra, question to you, balancing protection of wildfires versus the need for housing.
There's a lot bound up in your question, right? You're asking about three things. You're asking about sprawl, you're asking about housing, and you're asking about wildfire preparedness. So I'll answer these sort of one at a time and also together. So just to begin, number one priority is building the right places and not in the wrong places. And we have a general plan. And that general plan was developed through an extensive process of consulting the community and engaging with our fire chiefs to figure out, where does it make sense to build and where does it not? And I think if we were following the general plan, which basically means if the county would stop voting to approve sprawl projects that violate the general plan, we would be setting ourselves up for much greater success in the long run. Because right now, when we're looking to build in violation of the general plan, those are in areas that are very hard to defend from wildfires. And I'm going to say a little bit further on this. That is an unfair burden on taxpayers, right? Because now we have to pay for more roads, pay for more services out in places that are not defensible and are ultimately unsafe for the homeowners who are purchasing homes out there. So it's not fair to the new homeowners, it's not fair to the taxpayers, and it's frankly a huge detriment to our entire community because it's putting our whole community at risk for wildfires. At the same time, we're creating more traffic and more congestion because we're building in places far away from where people work and shop and go to school. school. And so then they're stuck in the traffic and stuck on the road for long hours, which is contributing to climate change, is contributing to carbon emissions, which is contributing to wildfires. So if we want more wildfires, we should definitely build in violation of the general plan and sprawl areas. It's a false dichotomy to suggest that you have to build there in order to meet our affordable housing needs. Meeting our affordable housing needs is one of my #1 priorities. And if you look at our general plan, there's absolutely ample area and space to meet our RHNA obligations within the confines of what's already zoned for building and for home building within our existing general plan, not in wildfire prone areas. So we should be building homes where it's already zoned to build in areas that are not wildfire prone and that are already allowed within our general plan to meet our RHNA obligations. So there should not really be that conflict. And I'll say further, many of these sprawl projects, most of them are not affordable. They talk about attainable housing. So that basically means you're talking about 120% of AMI, of average median income, not meeting our affordable housing needs. So when you look at these projects that have been approved in violation of the general plan, they are not affordable and they're not meeting our affordable housing need. So the sprawl projects hurt us on wildfires, don't help us on affordable housing. In addition, part of what we have to be doing is absolutely investing in ensuring that our fire departments have the resources that they need to protect our communities. And that is one of the things that is certainly a priority for me. I'm also a trained emergency medical responder. And so, you know, I have a lot of empathy and sympathy for the work that these folks do every single day, defending our lives and our property and our communities. And they are not staffed appropriately and they don't have the resources that they need. And that is another thing that I do think we do need to be prioritizing on the Board of Supervisors. But to take this full circle, then the question is, well, how do we build the affordable housing if we, we're not building sprawl? I already said that there's zoning. The other piece of it is that when you dangle out the possibility that a developer can buy land that is not zoned for housing, so it's very cheap, you can buy cheap land, and then you can lobby your friends at the Board of Supervisors to change the zoning of that fire hazard land to something that you can build a big development project on, then you get what is called rents, windfall profits, from lobbying your friends and the supervisors to rezone that land in violation of the general plan. That is dissuading and discouraging investors and developers from building in the places we actually need to be developing. So one of the reasons that we don't have adequate investment and innovation and move to the kind of prefab solutions that Chris was talking about and being much more innovative and creative in building in the places we need to build to meet our affordable housing needs is because there's this sort of dangling promise that if you just go and you buy that land in the sprawl zone, you can go lobby, you can get 3 friends of votes on the Board of Supervisors, and then you can make a killing on that investment in a way that's a detriment to all of the rest of us and all of the rest of our safety and quality of our life. And so that is one of the things I would absolutely be opposing as a supervisor, would be these sweetheart deals with developers. I would instead be supporting and investing and partnering with developers who do want to invest and build in the places that are already zoned for building under the contours of a general plan that would not put our communities at fire risk.
Thank you. Switching gears to the climate action plan, I want to ask you, Kristin, the county has tried to get that right and twice lost in court on appeal. Why can't you guys get that right? And when will you?
I have to be careful on this one because, as you know, it's still in active litigation. So we're participating at this time in sorry, I got my kiddos calling me. I had to decline their call right there. So we have closed session meetings taking place on the cap. It's essential that we do get this right moving forward. I think we have some active dialogues that are occurring right now. Moving away from the cap, I think it's important to note that Terra brings up some good points about following the general plan. The problem is that even the general plan projects are being met with fierce opposition. So it would be lovely to just say, oh, let's just follow the general plan, except they're ending up in the same place, which is the courtroom, and being held hostage to not moving forward at all. I have begged local environmental groups to sit down at the table with me. I have told them I will roll out a map of the entire San Diego region, and you tell me where the housing can go. What are you going to support? And never ever can they come up with a single place that they're okay with this happening. These are the same people that come before the Board of Supervisors during a hearing on a general plan project, and they fight against it. They should be coming forward and supporting that project, but yet it never ever happens. So we have to get in a better place. We have to be consistent. We have to be in a place where we have an approved cap that isn't litigated forever. It's cost the county an absolute fortune. But at this point in time, we're still in closed session on that matter. So I'm limited to what I can say about it, other than the fact that I just hope we get in a better place where we can actually cooperate and do what's right by San Diegans. And it's a tough scenario.
Real quick, what responsibility do you have personally for the cost that the county has borne in terms of the failed litigation? I mean,
it's long ranging. I mean, this issue has predated much of my service on the Board of Supervisors, as Diane Jacob will tell you. I mean, this has been a lengthy issue for the board. Specifically, the cap itself isn't being litigated. It's the carbon offset matter that's being litigated. Here's the deal. I think you'd have all 5 supervisors saying that it would be better to mitigate inside of San Diego County. The problem is we don't have the opportunity to do that within San Diego County, and instead are relying on a registry that everybody else is relying on too throughout this country. The problem with the projects in San Diego is that we're not seeing a lot of movement forward with wind, with solar projects. And those types of projects are really appropriate in the unincorporated area. And unfortunately, most of those projects have been blocked. So it's a real challenging scenario. I think my preference would always be to do the mitigation here in San Diego, as opposed to relying on a bank. But we just don't have the opportunities. Now, if I had the support of 3 supervisors to move forward on some of these important projects here in our region, I would do it. But so far, it's been challenging to count to 3 on several of these issues and doing more projects here.
Terra, how would you handle the climate action plan? And would we be in a different position as a county if you were on the board currently?
We would absolutely be in a different position. First of all, my opponent has voted to appeal and to continue the appeal. So we've lost those cases. Matt, you said twice. We've lost 3 times. And my opponent has voted to continue spending a lot of taxpayer money on county council to litigate those appeals. When, in fact, when we lost in district court, we should have settled from the outset and devised a new and better climate action plan that actually met minimum, just basic state standards, as opposed to continuing to litigate it in court. So we would have already begun to address this problem. I would never have voted to continue litigating these plans at taxpayer expense, number 1. Number 2, there is a lot we can do in county in terms of mitigation offsets, but beyond that as well, we have the opportunity here in San Diego to chart a bold climate action plan that could be a model for the rest of the country. We don't need to just look at how do we fiddle at the margins to sort of meet the concerns that the judge ruled upon. Under my leadership, we would be looking at how do we bring the business community together? How do we bring the environmental community together? Certainly if I was on the Board of Supervisors and I was in my opponent's position of having a majority, I would certainly be able to count to 3 to win that, to win that kind of cooperation, because I spent my life sort of building these collaborative coalitions and these kinds of cooperations. I talked previously about one of the things I'd be looking to do, and that was try to get to some of our greenhouse gas reduction targets by partnering with businesses to encourage employees to work from home. So that's one way we can look outside the box in meeting these targets. Another way we can look outside the box to meet these targets in terms of our offsets here in San Diego is I would favor the creation of a carbon mitigation bank. So that way, and that's local. That is county run, so that we are able to do mitigation projects at scale within the county of San Diego, as opposed to sort of pushing it off on developers to try to find that project on their own, which is very, very difficult to do. But if we had projects pay into a mitigation bank to fund those offsets at scale, we could get economies of scale in the mitigation offsets right here in San Diego. I want to Matt, I could talk your ear off on this because I worked
30
with the World
seconds,
Bank.
30 seconds.
I worked with the World Bank on their climate finance facility, right? Where we were working around the world on climate finance and basically these questions of how do we get green energy investments in a way that spurs local and regional economic growth and is also green. And there is just so much we could learn from other countries. And one of the things that I'm excited to do as a supervisor is to partner with our local university community that has been putting together a program to champion a climate action plan that incorporates and foregrounds social equity in how we think about the construction of that plan, so that we're borrowing from best practices from other parts of the world, because these are experts, these are leading experts who've been working on climate action plans with other countries, and they're right here at UCSD. They're right here in the School of Policy Studies where I teach, and they're ready and they're excited to bring that expertise to San Diego. And so with them, I would be working to have a gold standard climate action plan that bring folks together, bring the community that around the table, and be one of the best in the country. And I will stop because I'm trying to respect you and be brief. But this is my favorite topic. So
yeah, let me just ask one other question, and then I'll kick the mic to my colleagues on the board. So much is made of this race being a pivotal race, party-wise, Republican or Democrat. The fate of the board rests in this race. I don't want to cover that ground, but I want to approach it from a different angle. I'm curious of each of you, has anyone from the other party endorsed you? So Terra, are you endorsed by any Republicans? And Supervisor, are you endorsed by any Democrats? And Terra, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I'm actually endorsed by a lot of Republicans and Democrats sort of across the aisle. I mean, I've spent my career building coalitions and trying to just be practical and pragmatic in solving problems, and I think that's inspired a lot of trust. So I don't want to bore you all. You can look at the website, but I mean, my endorsements really run the gamut and include some of our more conservative building trades and some of our more conservative members of our community that are business minded, and but they're really looking for practical leadership, and they see that that's what I'll bring. And I think a good bellwether is Brian Mainshine, right, who was a Republican and he's a Democrat, and he was quick to endorse because he's just looking for someone who he can work with to solve problems.
Supervisor?
Well, it might surprise you to know I'm endorsed by my parents, who would describe themselves as very liberal. So I think that's a compliment right there. But it really tells you a lot about my upbringing. I could be at war or at odds with my own family, or I could listen and understand that no party has it right 100% of the time. And what concerns me the most right now with the division that's occurring is the inability to hear other viewpoints or even consider other viewpoints. So one thing that you should know about me, anytime I think I come to the table with my mind made up on an issue, I challenge myself. I try to Google search myself out of that opinion. And I think it's really important because I crave that so much. Now we all live in our little siloed worlds where we create our own Facebook world of people, and it's an echo chamber and it's not right. I will say I'm supported by many members of the community that are part of the Democratic Party, that are independents, that are Republicans as well. It gets more challenging when you start talking about elected officials that support you in office that are from the opposite party. And I think that's really quite sad too. But generally speaking, and it probably works this way with Terra as well, when you go run and ask for the endorsement of your political party, you literally sign something that says that you won't be endorsing across the aisle. And I think that's really unfortunate. I want to point to my track record with someone that is very special to me. In Escondido in particular, I've done my best work in Escondido because of Mayor McNamara there. He's a Democrat, and we abandon all political party and we do what's right by the community. We've been able to get innovative work off the ground right there in the Escondido community because we don't see one another as independents, Democrats, Republicans. We just see each other as human beings, and we've known each other for a while through the Rotary Club. That's more of the leadership it's going to take. It's unfortunate because my opponent has already said that she does not plan to work across the aisle, does not plan to work with certain elected leaders, in particular the administration. Depending on who's in that chair, she will or will not work with them. And I think that's wrong. I think it's really important that we work with everyone. That's what produces the results here. Interesting to note, that when I work with the governor, I'm criticized by Republicans. When I work with the president, I'm criticized by Democrats. But it's not my job to work with who's popular. It's my job to do what's best for San Diego, period, end of story. Please know that $5 billion of the county's budget is actually passed through state and federal funds. You have to be willing to work with whoever fills the chair as your governor, as your president. And so you have my personal commitment, no matter who fills those seats, that I will be working and I will be doing what's right by San Diego, criticism aside.
Terra, 30 seconds to respond to that about working across the aisle.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, you know, Mayor McNamara was one of my earliest and staunchest supporters. He's working fervently to help me get elected. So he absolutely is committed to a change of leadership because he really knows he does need a better and different partner at the supervisor. So just think it's important to correct the record for folks, as well as to note that I think one of my opponent's challenges that she's had, and she's mentioned a number of times, or, you know, I think certainly the voters will be able to judge for themselves, but she said she, you know, even with a majority on the board, she hasn't been able to count to 3 on her biggest initiatives, right? And she is not endorsed even by her colleagues on the Board of Supervisors, 2 of her Republican colleagues. All these folks that she keeps mentioning that she works with have endorsed me because they know that I'm going to be a really good partner to work with them. You know, she mentions working with the governor. The only time I've ever heard her talk about the governor is when she says the governor doesn't open her letters or respond to her appeals. So it doesn't sound like they're very much working together at all, if you ask me. So I think, again, it'll be for the voters to judge. But, you know, my record and my commitment is to be working with all folks, whatever your political stripe, and to just be working in a very practical way to solve problems, because I come from this work as a researcher, right? You know, you look at the evidence, you might have a hypothesis or you might have a theory, but I don't go to Google. I go to sources that are scientific and evidence-based and expert to figure out, you know, whether my hypothesis is right or not. And I'm always quite open. And some of my good friends and some of my big supporters, some of my donors, some of the people I bounce ideas off with are very different in where they sit, and we always find common ground. And I think that's why I've been able to build such a big coalition of supporters, including folks in both parties, because my commitment is to just be practical and, you know, try to solve the problems facing San Diegans.
Thanks.
Just in a response to that, I'm not about optics at all. And that's something that you should know about me. I rarely ask for endorsements. I rarely seek endorsements. I have not asked for the endorsement of my colleagues, nor have my colleagues supported my opponent, apart from one who is running a campaign actively against me from 7 feet away in the office. But please know that I haven't asked for those endorsements, and that's pretty consistent. You saw when I ran for supervisor the first time, I ran against a Republican opponent in that primary. He had every single endorsement in the world, not because every single person supported him, but simply because in many instances, I don't ask. I'm not about optics, it's about doing the job. This isn't about me. I don't need the job, but I do believe the job needs me. And that's where I first entered politics.
Let me ask a quick follow-up for you.
You do have a list of endorsements on the website, and I mean, I know that they don't just offer them; you have to seek them and apply. So I see.
Yes,
you know, the
I said I
Association of
seek
General
them selectively, Tara. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me a
You
quick
can go
follow-up
about it
for
your
you.
own way. I have my own style.
A quick follow-up for you, Supervisor, because a fellow Republican, Diane Jacob, called you, quote, a little difficult to work with, and said, I think a change on the board will be good going forward. What do you say to that Diane Jacob, you know, feels the need to say something like that?
Hey, listen, I do a lot of work partnering with Diane Jacob right out of the gate. She got me involved in some of the most critical work and something near and dear to her heart with Alzheimer's. And I've been working actively with not only Supervisor Jacob, but all of my colleagues. The main thing to understand is I tend to work a little bit as an independent leader, in so much that it's not that I'm not building coalitions, but I'm vocal. And I'm willing to stand up and suggest when something isn't right. I'm not a yes person. And that's been consistent in my record. So whether I'm falling on a 4-1, a 3-2, a 5-0, and by the way, most of the time, the board votes together. and we're united in things. It's very rare that the division exists, and the division usually exists over controversial projects. So when I was seated on the board, perhaps she thought she was getting someone that was a little bit more of a yes person. That certainly isn't me. I need to make sure that I'm properly evaluating all of these projects, all of these community concerns that we have, and important that you speak up when something isn't right. And I'm always willing to do that. At the end of the day, I appreciate all of my colleagues. I think describing them all as Republican, colleagues, we have a lot of people like me that are more moderate in nature that are on that board. So it's just hit and miss. And I have appreciated my time with Supervisor Jacob greatly, but she didn't get a solid yes vote every time from me just because I happen to be a Republican colleague seated on that board.
Thanks, Supervisor. Let me open it up, speaking of colleagues, to my peers on the board for questions.
Well, since both of you brought up Escondido has not always been a wonderful and pleasant place to live for a lot of Latinos who were, the police department was accused of stopping a lot of undocumented people and people for being brown-skinned up there for quite a while. Moving into other issues where you're going to have to vote, not just in your own district, but outside of the district. What will you do for this growing Latino population and people of color in general as the Asian population continues to grow and Black Lives Matter movement has obviously brought some attention to the disparities in San Diego County?
Supervisor, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, structured racism does exist in San Diego County. It exists across this entire country, and as elected leaders, it's up to us to work together to solve this significant challenge. I will say that there are broad coalitions that are forming today to do this difficult work, but these coalitions were forming already. Starting with my work with addressing disproportionality in the child welfare system, that was something of significance that I've been working on. We have an overrepresentation of African-American children in the child welfare system, and that needs to be improved. I do a lot of work in the Escondido community and all throughout my district. And one area that I've really focused on is juvenile justice and reform measures there as well. In Escondido specifically, we were able to open one of 2 achievement centers. This is work I'm really proud of. I've flown across the country looking for best practices, looking for how we empower our youth, particularly youth that may come from challenging circumstances, lower income families, poverty, gangs, a life where their parents may be involved in crime or they themselves are involved in the juvenile justice system. We found that a lot of our juvenile offenders, they become adult offenders and they never are set up to have a chance otherwise. So what we did was we took this model that we found in New York and DC and brought it back to San Diego. Now, this is for kids that are on probation. And the thought once was that you just lock these kids up, you keep them in juvenile hall, and they weren't improving through any of that. And most of the time, these young kids couldn't actually comply with their probation orders at all. In fact, the reoffense rate was really high. Over 80–90% of the time, they're reoffending. So what we did was create a system in Escondido and in the South Bay where these kids are picked up after school. They're fed, number 1. Many are from food insecure families. Number 2, they're given life skills coaching, peer mentoring, vocational skills training. They keep up on their studies. They have some social time, they're fed dinner, they're brought home. And lo and behold, something so simple and actually a beautiful partnership back with the community, these kids are able to comply with their probation orders 97% of the time and never touch that justice system again. That's a major achievement, but it takes hard work. It takes doing things a different way. I will say that I am proud of our sheriff's department. I'm proud of our district attorney in particular, because before we had a lot of the protesting occurring in the San Diego region, for example, they were at work trying to figure out a better way to engage in the community so that people always felt safe and protected and willing to approach them. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes with work that's very critical. We have to continue to foster this work and be committed to this journey.
Did that answer your question, Laura?
Yes.
Okay. Terra, to you.
Yeah. A couple things. First of all, I do think this is an area where you can see some clear differences. Just my opponent, myself. For example, she voted to join the Trump lawsuit against basically to stop our ability to have sanctuary cities and municipalities and counties and states in California. And I don't agree with that, right? I think that Laura's pointed out something really important, which that there has been a history of challenges and difficulties and discrimination against Latinos and communities of color across California, especially in Escondido. And I do support having a sanctuary approach to protect those communities, but also to protect public safety. Because when people are afraid that they might be deported, they're also afraid to call the police about domestic violence. They're afraid to call the police about crimes happening in our community, and it makes all of us less safe. So that's certainly an area that we definitely disagree. But zooming back from that, you ask a really important question about racial justice, about inequality, about the fact that we in our country do have a legacy of historical systemic racism. And it shows up in many places. And we've seen it most recently in the really brutal killings of some young Black men and women in encounters with law enforcement, but that's not the only place. It's much more pervasive than that. And so one of the things that I think we need to be doing at the county is following some of the recommendations actually that Jerry Sanders, our San Diego City's former police chief, former mayor, outlined a couple months ago in an op-ed where he really looked carefully at how do you look at doing trainings to give police law enforcement better tools to de-escalate and demilitarize and sort of look at their role as problem solvers as opposed to always coming in with force as the only tool in their toolkit. I think that's really vital and certainly something I support. Another thing I absolutely would be championing is an approach to public safety that puts public safety first, that again doesn't look at every problem as necessarily an immediate public safety threat, but instead says if this is a mental health issue, if this is a call that does not require a law enforcement response, if it's going to be better met with social service workers or folks who are trained in mental health crises to meet the needs of the people in distress in our community and also protect our public safety, that's who should be sent. And there are models of this in Eugene, Oregon. They have a program called Cahoots, where you have the ability to send out crisis teams to respond to urgent calls if it's not a public safety threat. So I think that's another thing that we could be doing, that we'd be much better meeting the needs of our community rather than just if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So that's another area that I would be championing. And then the third thing is just like, frankly, just looking at what is the role of our county. Our county plays many roles, but one of the most fundamental roles is to be protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. And I just think the county for the last 30 years, and certainly the last 4 years, has not done that, has not done a good job. We have one of the lowest rates of folks on food stamps in our county, even though we have a high rate of people who are eligible for food stamps in our county. And that's because we have not invested in the basic outreach that we need to ensure that people have access to those services. And that means that we're leaving money on the table from the state and the federal government that is actually should be being spent locally in our community, that's already allocated to our community, to people that are in need and people who are vulnerable. But our county just has not prioritized that safety net and meeting the needs of our most vulnerable populations. And that's absolutely another thing that we need to be doing. So I think across the board, there's a lot we could do better. And that's one of the ways that I would take the supervisors in a different direction.
Thank you both.
San Diego County has been run for years by administrators, first Walt Eckert and now Helen, who think that they basically can never do anything wrong. During the hepatitis crisis in 2017, it's rather incredible in retrospect that the county waited until the end of August to declare a health emergency after hundreds of people had gotten sick. So to Supervisor Gaspar, I asked, what do you think about the fact that the county did so bad with hepatitis A? And to your challenger, would you try to get rid of these people because they're still in power? The health officials who made these decisions and Helen are still in power.
So it's important to note that what we're seeing today is very similar. The public health officer has an enormous amount of powers when an emergency declaration is made. And certainly I think it's important that we listen to our clinical leadership team. It's easy to look back on reflection and point to situations that could have been managed better, but please know from a board's perspective, we're taking the lead of our clinicians internally at the County of San Diego. We do not have the ability to hire and fire our public health officer. That exists within the director of the Health and Human Services Agency. The people that we can hold accountable are CAO and our legal counsel as well. I think it's important to note that a lot did go well in terms of the county's response and ultimately closing out that hepatitis A outbreak as a community. The vaccination effort was significant. The field nursing effort was significant. Our ability to partner with our local municipalities and help fund some services that were critical to bring this to a close was significant. So I know that there's a lot that in retrospect we could say we wish we had done differently, but there's a lot that really did go right, so much so that that work has been acknowledged outside of San Diego. At the same time, I've always been known for challenging the status quo, for pushing institutional boundaries, for holding people accountable. And like I mentioned before, there's a reason why that housewife canvas painting exists on my wall. We can't act like we're perfect. And for the longest time, that was the situation. We need to acknowledge, like we did at the conclusion of Hep A, what in our effort, what in our response could have been better. I can tell you in our management of this pandemic, we learned a lot through Hep A. So you saw the county really learn from prior experiences with Hep A. And in fact, we declared that state of emergency very quickly. It was not very romantic, but we declared that state of emergency on Valentine's Day. This is significantly earlier than other jurisdictions in the entire state of California. So we did lead in our response by over 2 weeks. I think that's a testament to lessons learned and applied through hepatitis A. And at this point in time, it's really important that we take those lessons and apply them. You have the public health officer that responded to Hep A, that's responsive to this pandemic now, has been on the forefront of this. And in situations where an emergency is declared, you see that the board has less power. In other words, the public health officer at the end of the day is calling the shots.
Terra?
I just want to agree. Hep A was a total crisis, a total catastrophe. The board should take accountability, and I actually don't agree. I don't think I haven't seen any evidence that we learned from those mistakes, because I think we've made a similar set of mistakes in failing to mount an adequate public health response to COVID-19, as evidenced by the fact that we still don't have this virus under control. This many months later, and we've been on this sort of catch our tail journey, and including with my opponent trying to reopen in May, long before we were ready. I think it's a big crisis. I think we haven't risen to the moment. And in terms of, how do we deal with that? Absolutely. We have to respect expertise and we have to respect evidence. But a big part of the job as a supervisor will be, management and making sure we have the right folks doing those jobs. And I'm going to be taking a really careful look at that.
Additional questions?
I wanted to ask, since it was brought up, Supervisor, do you still hold those same views, and would you vote the same today on the Trump sanctuary policy? And Terra, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your proposals on immigration.
Great. Which first?
It's
Supervisor
important to,
Supervisor first.
I think it's important to really understand the impacts back from SB 54. Now, the intent, of course, was to increase that feeling of safety, that our that individuals living in our community felt like they could still report crimes and such. And of course, we want our community to feel comfortable. But the practical application of SB 54 is this. If someone has come into this country illegally, and they're committing crimes, they're committing harm back on our citizenry, that's a problem. And I don't think that that should be supported. What's equally problematic is the inability for our local law enforcement to even make Customs and Border Patrol aware of when releases from our jails are happening. That means that individual is back out in the community. It does not mean that that individual is not being pursued for deportation. What it does mean is we put more Border Patrol presence back out in our communities looking for this individual. And if this individual is in a family situation and they come upon more people in that household, then more people can be deported. So I just think that the practical application of this is highly problematic if people are telling me they'd like to see less of that Border Patrol presence. Beforehand, if you were committing crimes or repeat crimes on our citizenry, that deportation happened at the jail, happened upon discharge from the jail. And so it's just important for people to get to know and understand what SB 54 is. Oftentimes people like to confuse this with immigration. That's not what we're talking about. Frequently, my opponent mischaracterizes my support for several other things, says that I voted against supporting the migrant shelter in San Diego. That's not the case. I voted in the affirmative for that. I voted in the affirmative to continue to see refugees coming to San Diego. So it's often that people like to mix SB 54. We're talking about people committing crimes on others and immigration and even migration to this country. Please know, as the chairwoman of the board and as a member of this board, when people become citizens of this country, it's a really proud moment for them, and we should be proud of them too. And so I issue certificates of congratulations when individuals become US citizens too. Immigration reform is sorely needed in this country. That's not something that we manage on the Board of Supervisors. Really hopeful that our congressional members get in their chairs and do the tough work to make sure that immigration reform is done and people can become citizens of our country through that process.
Tara, the question
Thanks.
of immigration.
Yeah, I do. Again, I think this is another place where you do see a very big divide between myself and my opponent. You know, not to characterize her position for herself, right? I think voters can decide, but I think she's, you know, certainly taken the Trump agenda and the Trump script on how she wants to tackle immigration, and that's just not how I see it. But, you know, she stands with Trump on this, and I understand that. You know, my approach is different. I think that we should be really focused on supporting our immigrants who are here, especially folks that are trying to seek asylum. I think that we need an expanded Office of Immigrant and Refugee Services. I think that should be a big priority, partly because many of these people can be really valuable members of our community, but they just need a little bit of support to get the services they need to get integrated, to get on their feet. And then in terms of people who are seeking asylum, they absolutely should have their day in court and should make their claims known. I mean, many of these people are fleeing the most desperate of situations, right? Where they're being hunted down by drug lords in their own country, where they're being persecuted for being members of the press, where they are victims of sex trafficking crimes, where they are just so unsafe in their own communities, and they deserve asylum here because our country has been built on this promise, right? You know, send us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. And we could do a lot better at the county in ensuring that that basic American promise is fulfilled to people who are coming to our country and who are seeking a better life and who have so much to offer to our community.
Do you want a quick response to that, Supervisor?
No, it's funny how she always goes back to Trump because that's the only area of disagreement that she has. Generally speaking, when people have nothing else and they see your track record and they need to criticize somewhere, they just come up with the tired Trump argument. Our community's tired of that too.
We got time probably for one last question. Who wants to throw it out?
I've got one if no one else does. We can go back to housing. There's a measure for rent control being put on the state, and there's been efforts locally to do similar things. I'm wondering what both of your positions are on the efficacy of rent control.
And Prop 15.
Well, rent control is an absolute no. In fact, I haven't found an economist yet that says that rent control would actually be a good idea and be helpful in the long run. Probably best put in a Wall Street Journal article I was reading about, it's a game of musical chairs. You're not changing the number of chairs that are in the room or who can live in a certain part of your community. You're basically removing a chair and you're suggesting that certain people can live somewhere. This is not a long-term solution at all. Absolutely opposed to rent control policies. It's all wrong for San Diego or anywhere else in this country. There's consistent agreement among all economists. So I'm curious to know what my opponent has to say on Proposition 15. Again, we are struggling. We are in the middle of economic crisis. Please do not raise taxes one more time. This is often sold to people as, oh, it's just big, massive property owners that are impacted. That's not the case. Our small business community is impacted by this. The other day, my opponent was talking about her support for Prop 15. She was bringing up during her interview a local pancake house and how this money generated from Prop 15 could really help this local small business because money would be taken from a large property owner. It would go to support our schools, and then it would go to support the county, and we need those dollars, and we could help that pancake house owner by giving him a grant back. Wow, what a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work, because that same property owner was used as an example just the day before by our local team that ran the numbers on the difference in property taxes that this small business would have to pay under Proposition 15. In fact, it amounted to $30,000 in an increase for this small business. So I'm curious to know how that $30,000 would go to work and come back to this small business owner in the form of a grant. People are struggling, our businesses are struggling. Proposition 15 is all wrong for San Diego as well.
Terra?
Hi, thank you. Actually, I'm so happy to have the chance to talk about this. I'm grateful my opponent cited the authority of economists on this question and these two questions, because that's my background and training. So forgive me if I sort of profess a little bit on this, but let's just take these separately because they're very different. So starting with the rent control question, I think in general, rent control is not a solution to the housing crisis. It just isn't. You don't get more housing stock because of rent control. I think that the ballot proposition on our ballot on this cycle, it's a little bit of a red herring. I would say both sides are making sort of a mountain out of a molehill. Basically, because at the end of the day, it's saying it's trying to give local control to local municipalities and governments to decide whether or not to enact rent control measures. Most of them wouldn't. My view is that the current situation that the compromise that we reached last legislative cycle with a rent stabilization measure at 5% is a great compromise, because we certainly do see that there's a balancing act. So if you have radical increases in property prices very quickly, then you destabilize communities. You lead to people having to move out, the lack of community resiliency, a lack of people being able to stay in their own homes, and you do see people being forced out onto the streets or into substandard housing stock. On the other hand, you definitely don't want to discourage investments in new housing. And so I think that that agreement and that compromise from last legislative cycle is great, because it says, look, anything that's new, anything in the last 15 years, we're not going to have any kind of measures around, because that way we can continue to ensure that investors do make a profit and they're incentivized to build housing. At the same time, we have rent stabilization measures that allow for an increase in prices, but it's not so stark that people are going to be suddenly dislocated and kicked out of their house, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So my view is that that is a good deal, sort of a good, reasonable place. I will say that the evidence around rent stabilization is actually pretty positive from an economist point of view, because of the negative externalities associated with displacement of people very suddenly. But that's looking at the kind of measure we have at the state level, which does allow increases in rents. It just prevents us from having sudden dramatic increases in rents, but you can still have those rent increases, just not suddenly and dramatically. So my view is that this sort of battle over this proposition is a little bit of a mountain over a molehill, or because what we have at the state level is probably going to govern and actually does make a lot of sense on the rent stabilization that was passed last cycle.
So to be clear though, on the ballot measure, you're a yes or a no?
I'll be honest, I haven't decided. I mean, I'm really thinking about it. It just hasn't, because it just doesn't feel like it's going to impact our community very significantly. It hasn't been a priority, and I'm still like weighing it. I haven't come down one way or the other because, like I said, I just don't think I think it's just like a distraction. Prop 15. So let's just talk a little bit about Prop 15. It is so important.
If you could just keep this one in the interest of time.
I'll do my best.
Prop 15, 60 seconds, start the clock.
I'll try. We have to close the loophole that was created by Prop 13, right? Prop 13 is great. It defends homeowners from rising property taxes, which has been really important. And I think we have to defend Prop 13. But what Prop 13 did is it created a giant loophole for a few big companies like Chevron, because everyone else, when they sell their homes, they have to then pay higher property taxes on the new property they acquire. Chevron is just creating shell companies to pass property through, therefore doesn't have a legal transfer, and therefore their property taxes don't increase. So what we've seen is this massive shifting of the tax burden from a few big companies like Chevron and Disney to small businesses and homeowners over the last 40 years since Prop 13 was passed. So the only way we can protect homeowners and protect small businesses is to close this loophole so big companies like Chevron pay their fair share, because right now all the rest of us are paying significantly more of the property tax burden than these big companies. And when I think about this challenge that we face with COVID-19, of getting our schools reopened, of getting our community back on track, of making sure the small businesses have the support they need to provide PPE, to open, to stay socially distanced, to invest in our public health, to invest in our public health officers, to make sure we can scale up contact tracing, scale up testing, that we can make sure that our schools can reopen and it can have the class sizes and the teachers that they need and the facilities they need so our students can get back to work. Prop 15 is a really important way that our schools and communities are going to have those resources to protect our public health and ultimately to get our economy reopened. So it's absolutely essential that we do invest in these public health resources and in our schools, and we do it in a way that's fair, that protects homeowners and protects small businesses. And I understand there's a lot of fear out there about Prop 15, but that's because there's a lot of basically, frankly, false and misleading statements being shared that this is going to impact Prop 13, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's closing a loophole in Prop 13 so we can protect all of us more fairly. And I think it's really important that people know the truth. And I'm very, I think it's unfortunate that, we haven't had that kind of honest conversation, but that sort of honesty and transparency about what's at stake and what it's going to take to meet the moment is a lot of what I'm going to bring to the work as a Board of Supervisor.
But that's just not remotely.
We got to wrap it up, Chris. We got to wrap it up.
Yeah, Chris.
In 2016, the legislature considered legislation to close loopholes that allowed, that would prevent the way, property taxes from being changed by ending the shell company thing. And Democrats made a conscious decision not to do that because they wanted to vastly raise taxes on people who were following the rules. That's just not true when you characterize this as being some kind of dishonest shell game. There's genuine terror among businesses that already pay high taxes that their rates are going to go up 500%. 500%.
So let me respond. I do want to acknowledge that there are people who will be hurt, and that's not fair, and it's not right. That are small businesses, and it certainly would be one of my commitments as a supervisor to make sure that those folks do get support, do get the kind of assistance that I've been talking about. Because you're right, there are people who are going to be unfairly hurt, but across the board, vast majority of the tax innocence is going to be held by 10% of companies, actually less, 8%. 92% of
I'm gonna
people will
cut you
not
off.
see
Let's
any
leave
kind
it-
of tax increase.
Let's
Which
leave
is
it there.
all
You
false
guys-
because we're all being hurt. If you drive up the cost of those property taxes for those property owners, it drives up the cost of not only rents, it drives up the cost of all goods and services.
That is not true. Now we get to talk about what I know a lot about, right? Which is economics.
Well, let's do this.
And
Let's
basic
put a pin-
economics,
let's-
basic
I'm gonna-
supply and
time out.
demand. Prices are set in a
I'm gonna
market,
put a pin-
and
I'm
that's
gonna
not
put a
how
pin-
prices
I'm
are
gonna
set.
put- I'm going to put a pin in this conversation. We can talk about Prop 15 another day. Let's take 2 minutes for your close. And if you want to talk about Prop 15 in your close, you can do it for 2 minutes then. And Supervisor, why don't you go first?
Well, listen, I'll just say that I'm the CFO of a local small business. I feel like my opponent has simply read a book, and that's happening a lot. It's a common theme throughout this interview. Lots of grand plans and things will work out well on paper, just no plan to actually implement those. And even worse, no check to implement it with. We are in a financial situation. We're in the middle of an economic crisis. The county is not an exception to this. For the very first time, we had to dip into our 2 months of operational reserves. If the county is having to do something of that nature, you can only imagine the impacts back to our local municipalities. When this CARES Act funding runs out, it's going to get leaner and leaner. And so this election matters. It matters a whole lot. When I was first seated on the Board of Supervisors, it was unclear at that time what my passion and purpose would ultimately be on that board. I can tell you with conviction, I found it. I decided to work on the things that were really challenging us the most as society. These were the things that you couldn't point to in 4 years and say, hey, I fixed that. This was all of the messy, tough work. But I signed myself up for it. And I raised my hand to work with the most vulnerable populations out there in society, the elderly, the incarcerated, the drug addicted, the homeless. And so I've been in search of innovation, programs with proven outcomes to really bring back to San Diego. I've worked really hard to identify local organizations that we have back in our community with the understanding that government cannot solve these significant social challenges alone. And it's going to take these same types of partnerships to uplift us from a multitude of issues, whether it be mental health, substance abuse, human trafficking, homelessness, housing, transportation, wildfire protection, prevention. These are the areas that I'm working in. Please pay close attention to the track record of my opponent and who's supporting my opponent. There's a reason why she's receiving financial support from the head of SANDAG, the executive director of SANDAG, who I have vocally opposed his plans. There's a reason why she's received the support of William Ayers, the domestic terrorist responsible for bombings of the Pentagon and police stations. That doesn't show up by accident. Chesa Boudin, the DA from San Francisco. There's a reason this individual appears. And of course, the Hollywood elite that also fills her contribution list. Please pay attention. My opponent is quite radical, quite extreme, but of course she left paid consulting jobs with Soros and SEIU. You need servant leaders on the Board of Supervisors. This seat cannot be bought. We've already dealt with Soros 2 years ago with the DA's race where he brought $2 million to San Diego to try to buy that seat. This seat is not for sale. I'm proud to be here as a servant leader. I'm proud to guide you through these significant challenges, and I ask for your support over the next 4 years.
Thank you. Terra?
Thank you. So I want to say we face a critical moment in San Diego. And I believe that if we have had the kind of leadership on the Board of Supervisors that you think has been sufficient to this challenge, if you think over the last 30 years we've had the kind of leadership that San Diego deserves, if you think over the last 4 years that my opponent has brought the kind of collaborative spirit, the ability to work with others, the ability to get things done, if you believe that to be true, then, you should support her. I don't think so. I think that the last 30 years of the Board of Supervisors has been really a pretty dismal record. It's been dismal on jails. It's been dismal on social services. It's been dismal on climate and housing. It's been dismal on traffic and transportation. And my opponent will be more of the same. And we've already seen 4 years where she has spent quite a bit of time storming out of meetings, fighting with people, not getting anything done. And that she's proven who she is and what her track record is on the board. I bring a very different set of experiences. I'm a third generation San Diegan. My grandpa was a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton. So I come to this work with public service as a family value, as the first and foremost orientation in everything I do. And I spent some time working in the Obama Treasury Department as a senior advisor, working on climate investment, working on green energy, and most importantly at this present moment, working on helping economies around the world recover from economic crises. And when I stepped forward to run for the seat, I did not know that that would be such an important skill and such an important set of experiences, but that is so clearly what we need. We need someone in this role who brings two things. One, a lifetime of looking at evidence, bringing an evidence-based, practical, problem-solving approach to the issues, not being ideological, not being aligned with what, one party or another. And secondly, someone who really can work across aisles. So that is what I bring to the job. I do want to take, it's unfortunate my opponent has left, I do want to take a moment to just respond to some of her sort of outlandish accusations. I don't think I need to speak too much. I think the voters will make their own assessment. But of course, this is the same kind of desperate attacks that anyone makes when their campaign is sinking. You look at my list of endorsements. I've been endorsed by virtually every organization in San Diego, every leading community group, almost every single elected official. Her endorsement list is basically the Building Industry Association and the AGC, and the Lincoln Club. So you want to talk about people who are bought and paid for and we're representing special interests on our county board. She makes all these accusations that I'm a radical, which, let's just be clear. I had a top secret compartmentalized security clearance in the Treasury Administration. So I don't think I could really be very radical. A bunch of other stuff she says about me is blatantly not true. She's been telling people I'm a socialist. This is false. It is a straight up lie. She's been telling people, that I'm going to follow some radical Soros agenda, which, honestly, I find frankly offensive as anti-Semitic. It's part of this anti-Semitic trope that, we see Trump throwing around as well. And I'm grateful that I've been able to build a big tent. It's actually a big compliment that Chesa donated to my campaign. He was a friend in college. So the fact that he looked me up some 22 years later and made a contribution, I thought that was very sweet and nice. Again, I want to say that I think what this job needs is it needs someone who is committed to working with many, many people across the aisle to get things done, committed to a pragmatic approach, and brings a breadth and depth of experience to be able to learn what's worked and not worked in other places. Because all of the time, there's going to be policy differences and there's going to be disagreements and people are not going to agree. But the real testament of leadership is, can you get people who don't agree around the table and find a third vote, find a way to yes, find a way to be practical in the face of our challenges. And that's what I've spent my life doing. And it would really be a real honor to earn your endorsement.
Thanks, Terra. I appreciate it. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.